Hi everybody, I'm Joshua Flitcroft, thank you for tuning in. A UI programmer at sort of IO Interactive. I've been here sort of now just over a year, sort of working in the UI team and the various game projects and sort of on the Backbone team. And so today I just wanted to do this webinar sort of on intro into making games and how we can sort of make them more accessible and sort of what we're doing here at IO Interactive. I think first of all, it's important to think and know about the different types of disabilities that really we're looking at helping and sort of making our games more accessible for. I think otherwise it can sort of be more abstract what it means of making games accessible. It's sort of we're making games more accessible for trying to help gamers with these sort of disabilities. So the first is kind of like a motor disability, and so the way that this is for gamers who have limited range in sort of movement. In sort of some of their limbs and sort of not able to hold on to a controller properly. We also have like a visual disability. So this is gamers with sort of partial or sort of limited sort of sight in one or both eyes. Audio gamers who have partial or sort of full loss of hearing in both ears or one ear. Sort of cognitive, so gamers who sort of struggle to process information of what's going on in the game or finding scenes too distressing. And sort of being able to struggle to retain information and speech. And so this is sort of gamers who, when they speak, so people are unable to sort of understand what they're saying. And so I think it helps to sort of just explain and sort of understand that these are the sort of key areas that when we're looking at making games more accessible, these are the sort of disabilities that we're trying to address. So I think the also really great thing to think about sort of really before we jump in to more about the accessibility is stopping to think about what a gamer looks like. Because I think when each of us sort of picture a gamer in our mind, we might all have different views. And so I know for me personally, if I think of a gamer, I think of sort of someone who's sitting on a couch, a couple of feet away from their TV, sort of controller in hand, and sort of that's how they play, sort of that sort of distance and sort of controller. But that's not how all gamers play. For example, Aaron here is a gamer with a motor disability, which means that he's actually unable to hold on to a controller with his hands. So he has a specialized setup instead now where he plays with his feet. So he has one controller per foot, and then some buttons sort of for his arms, and he's able to play games through this way. And so that's sort of what one gamer looks like. And then we also have gamers like Steve, who is a gamer who is blind, and so when he's sort of playing at the distance I'd usually play at, this is the sort of thing he's seeing. It's sort of the text is just unreadable. Images are sort of blending into each other, like the minimap in the corner. It's sort of you just can't distinguish what's going on. And so I think it's really important that when we're looking at talking about making games accessible, we're not just doing it as an abstract way of how to make games accessible. We're thinking about how to make games more accessible for gamers like Aaron. So it's looking at features like, oh, is Steve going to have a problem with this? How's Aaron going to find this feature? And so I think it's really important that that's how we think about accessibility in terms of games. So what do we actually mean by accessibility? So I think the first thing to sort of help is that using the social model, we can define a disability as a mismatch between a person and their environment. So if we take someone in a wheelchair in a building with stairs, the disability would actually be the stairs. And so then the idea behind accessibility is avoiding this unnecessary mismatch between the person and their environment and sort of removing their barriers so that they're able to still access and do everything. So for example, in the person with a wheelchair, for the person in the wheelchair, we can make a building more accessible by adding a staircase. By adding an elevator, and that sort of can help make them everything. And so if we think about the general sort of game flow, and sort of try and adapt and think about accessibility in terms of games, with the game flow we receive some input, we process the information, and then we send the output to the game. So if we take a use case of, let's say, we have an online shooter where we have players running around, and if they have their name above their head, if the name is green, they're a teammate, and if the name is red, it's an enemy. So we receive the input, you see the person on screen, you see the red name, okay, process the information, that's a bad guy, I need to shoot them. But what about if a game is colorblind? The input that they're going to receive is just going to be a different kind of color. So the color that they might receive could look the same as a friendly teammate color. So when they're processing that information, they'll see it and be like, oh, that's a friendly person, I don't need to do anything. And then they don't do anything and so get shot. And so it's sort of looking at how we can make situations like that accessible. Well, it's like we can add another icon to sort of help distinguish the enemies, or we can also look at allowing them to customize these colors so that they're still able to distinguish between the enemy and the sort of the teammate. And that's sort of the idea of accessibility, of looking at the different features and sort of working out how we can make them, each of them sort of more accessible for the different types of disabilities that we sort of covered before. And so then with these accessibility options, we're resolving the issues and barriers, allowing everyone to sort of play and enjoy the games. So why spend resources on it? I think, as always, the tough sell with production and sort of game management is, it already takes so much time to sort of make these games. Why we should be spending more time on sort of accessibility. And so hopefully, some of these stats and numbers might help convince your teams. And so it's like looking at it, Xbox did a research a couple of years ago, and they found that 25 to 30% of Xbox gamers, so of all Xbox gamers, identified as having a disability, with then 10% of all Xbox gamers having a disability that impacts their gaming experience. And so bearing in mind, how many Xbox gamers there are, we're talking, tens of millions of Xbox gamers have a disability that, will struggles and means that they're unable to play certain games. And so that's, a huge number, and it's sort of, by not addressing accessibility, cutting off all these people from enjoying and playing a game. As the lead designer at Interior Night sort of puts it well, we spend so much time and effort building a game, so surely we want as many people as possible to play it and enjoy it. And so I think that's sort of really important about. That's really why we should be spending accessibility. Games aren't easy to make; they're not quick to make. A lot of time, effort, blood, and tears goes into these, and so by making the games more accessible, you're just sort of cutting out, rather than only being, let's say, 80 to 90% of Xbox gamers are able to play a game, it's like 100% of Xbox gamers would be able to play the game if the time is sort of spent on these accessibility options. Another reason is that Popcom survey did a survey, and they found that disabled gamers actually tend to play longer. So this was a survey done on mobile games, and so they found that 24% of disabled gamers played for 16 hours or more per week, as opposed to just 13% of non-disabled gamers. So I think it's sort of really impressive that if a game is truly accessible, disabled gamers are playing more of them. They're playing these games for longer. They're also actually spending more money on those games, sort of through in-app purchases, and they're also then recommending them more to their friends as well, because it's sort of a game that's accessible and enjoyable for them. Another great reason is this idea of solving for one and extending to many. So through this, what we mean is by improving and adding accessibility options for this one case, or for the case that we're thinking about for gamers with disabilities, it can actually then be extended to lots of different use cases that we never thought about. So for example, if by improving the subtitle technology for gamers who are hard of hearing, we can then, and sort of improving for them so they're able to enjoy it more, it can also then be applied to situations like a parent is playing a video game late at night, but they have to turn the sound off because they don't want to wake the rest of the family. But because we've improved the subtitle technology, they're able to still, enable the subtitles, customizing, getting the sound, and sort of include them all in like closed captions, sort of speaker indicators, so that they're still able to enjoy the full experience, despite having to maybe turn the sound off. And that's that's not a gamer with disability, but because of these accessibility options that we've put in, trying to solve one case, it can then be extended to all these other cases that we might not have thought about or originally planned for when sort of making the feature accessible. So it's another reason really to think about accessibility is to know it is important. It's a very important thing, and sort of one of the reasons is because it lets everyone get excited about the game that you're working on. So I know for me personally, I get super hyped when I see really cool cinematic trailers for new games. It's like I get so excited, looking forward to them. Maybe pre-ordering them. Um, but for some gamers, it's like they'd see that cinematic trailer and they'd be like, "Oh, that looks really cool. I hope it's accessible." Or I can't wait to play it, but I'm gonna have to wait to see the accessibility reviews to find out about the game, to see if it's actually something that I'm going to be able to enjoy. And so I think it's sort of really important to think about this and sort of make sure, the ultimate goal of having all games accessible to everyone and sort of talking about accessibility earlier on in the development lifecycle really just lets more people know about the features they're working on so that they're able to get more excited about games earlier on as opposed to having to wait until the game is released and hearing what other people have found it, which can sort of, takes away maybe some of the joy from it. Another important reason for it sort of just helps people enjoy gaming. Um, there's this great quote by Steve Saylor, and he says, "As a kid, I thought I sucked at games, but in reality, gaming sucked for me." And so this is, a gamer who's blind, and so earlier on, he was struggling with and when playing games. And so I thought that the reason that he was bad at it is because he was failing, he was doing things wrong. But in retrospect, it's the games were doing things wrong. It was on our fault because we weren't making the games more accessible for everyone. And so by improving and adding accessibility, it's sort of just helping everyone to enjoy games and know that if they're struggling with something, it's not their fault, it's the game's fault. And so by making them more accessible, it just lets people enjoy their hobbies more and sort of really truly enjoy everything that's sort of going on with the game. It's also important because by adding good accessibility in the game itself, it removes some of the need for expensive hardware and software for each of the gamers. So by adding menu narration into the game, it means that all the gamers don't have to try and add, optical character recognition running at the same time, or have a co-pilot in just to read what's going on in the game. And so I think it's really important that, by us doing and adding accessibility options, we're taking the overhead, as opposed to all gamers who need menu narration, them having to have that overhead. So it's sort of, I think it's important to know that by us spending the time and improving accessibility, it does make it easier for them to sort of be able to pick up and play games. It's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to accessibility. As we talked about the sort of 5 different areas of disability, there's no usually like accessible option that we can add and that will cover all those disabilities, because that's usually not how it works. Each disability needs to be thought of and addressed with each of the individual features to make sure it's accessible. And so rather than just trying to put in a couple of blanket options to try and cover everything, it is important to note that we have to look at each disability and each situation individually to make sure we're addressing them. And then it's also important to know that accessibility is something that should be improved over time. Like we do, bug fixing patches or game balancing patches, it's also great to do accessibility patches. So either adding new features or sort of improving some of the accessibility that's already gone in. It's sort of important to remember that accessibility is not a one and done. It's something that we should be continuously improving and adding over time as we're sort of learning more and finding out from gamers whether accessibility features are actually worked or not. So how do we make games accessible? So one of these great approaches is from sort of the Able Gamers charity, and they've sort of created this accessible player experiences APX. And so they have a lot of information on their website with some of the cards. And so what they've sort of done is, and this approach, it sort of focuses on making games accessible through 22 design patterns that they've created. And these are sort of split into two sort of sections, or sort of lenses, access and challenge. And so the idea is that these design patterns are applied to the individual game features of the game to work out how to make the overall game accessible by making the little bits accessible. So the first group of patterns is the access patterns. So the standard feedback loop for playing a game is you take your action, the game will changes, and you get your feedback about the new state. But this loop can be prevented if there's a mismatch between the ability from the gamer and sort of some of the design of the game. So if there's something that's not quite accessible, it sort of stops them from actually getting it into the game and sort of being able to access it. And so that's what these patterns are focusing on, is getting the player into the gameplay, letting them access the gameplay, and sort of tuning the game's experience depending on their individual needs. So one of the examples of the access pattern is the same controls but different. And so the idea of this is sort of just being able to remap all the controls and input, so everyone still has the same control of accelerating or braking, but it might just be that one person has on the right accelerate on the right trigger, another person has it on the A button, somebody else has it on left trigger. It's sort of the idea of letting them tune the experience so that if there's certain buttons they struggle to press at the same combination or at the same times, that by having this, they're able to sort of customize it and make it sort of better and more appropriate for their needs. Another example of this pattern is with the second channel, and so the idea is that rather than just only providing information in one channel, like audio or visual, but also providing it in another way. So for example, like Fortnite, where you have the audio of sort of like footsteps or sort of gunfire of what's going on, there's also an option to enable a visual output for it, so that if you're hard of hearing and not able to hear what's going on, you're also able then to have this another way to sort of still perceive the same information, so that you're not sort of left out or sort of missing information. You're able to still understand everything that's going on that everybody else is. And so that's sort of two really great patterns of how to help people access into the game. And then the other group of patterns they grouped is the challenge patterns. And so now that they're able to actually access the game and the gameplay, these patterns focus more on how players actually progress in the game. And so the idea about these is changing a challenge or a bit of gameplay from something that's impossible or unfun for them to something that's more possible and accessible. So, for example, with the bypass pattern, if gamers sort of really struggle with puzzles or sort of quick time events, it's adding an option to sort of skip them or sort of auto-complete them, so that they're able to still, if they really struggle with tapping button repeatedly for these quick time events, they're still able to skip that and have the option to then still play the rest of the game. And so by bypassing this, they're able to still enjoy the other parts of the game that they are able to play. But I suppose it is important to note that with the bypass pattern, that in some cases it's not just about having just a complete skip. For something like quick time events where it can be, tap to complete an event. Some gamers that will find tapping impossible, but holding itself is much easier and much more possible as opposed to tapping. And so it's sort of, by doing it through these options of having like quick time events, tap, hold, or autocomplete, it still allows gamers to sort of, again, customize that experience for what they personally are able to do. And so that way they can still have the sense of accomplishment of when they do the quick time event by holding, they still feel that satisfaction of being able to do it and complete it, as opposed to the game just taking away that sort of satisfaction and completion. So it is sort of, again, challenge is not just about, sometimes with the bypass, completely skipping things, but letting it customize to make what's more fun and accessible for them as an individual. And then another example of the challenge pattern is with the slow it down mode, or the slow down pattern for Celeste, where they're able to sort of customize the game speed so that if you struggle to process the information and sort of react to what's going on, you can just slow down the entire game, so you can sort of take more time to enjoy and think about what's going on. So then, making games accessible, the idea now is we take each of these sort of 22 design patterns and we apply them to the individual game features. Because that's really how we make games accessible, is by making the individual game features and designs accessible. And so we can apply these, and then we can usually then end up with accessibility options. So these are things like in the settings for auto completing quick time events, or sort of auto aim to help lock onto enemies, But then the other idea is accessibility by design, and so that's by making that feature accessible from the beginning. So making the actual core design of the feature and the game idea accessible, rather than having an option in the menu that sort of changes what some people are experiencing against others. So for example, in Dead by Daylight, their original wiggle mechanic was, you'd have to wiggle the joystick on a controller, but for some people that wasn't accessible and it wasn't able to be done, and so they sort of went back to the beginning and sort of redesigned this feature to instead be that you press a button when it's between two modes. So it's still not 100% accessible, but they sort of changed the idea and sort of how this feature and design works through the accessibility lens at the beginning, so that now there's just this one way to wiggle. There's no sort of different option that you're changing between sort of joystick for some gamers or sort of left bumper for others. It's sort of looking at the original design itself and making that accessible, as opposed to something that somebody has to enable or sort of tune later on. But it's also worth noting that accessibility is something that should actually be separate to difficulty. So Gears 5 added auto aim, which was great, but it was only available in certain difficulties, which meant that if you as a gamer sure found locking onto targets sort of impossible or not something that was able to be done, but the rest of the game you're still very up for and able to sort of participate and compete in, then it meant that those higher difficulties were locked away from you, because this lock-on was only available in the easier difficulties. So it's sort of meaning that certain gamers, if they still want that challenge of these extreme difficulties, they're no longer able to get that, just because an option that's seen as an accessibility option has sort of been locked behind a difficulty screen or difficulty select. And so I think it's sort of very important that accessibility and difficulty should always sort of be seen as two separate things. And it's also worth noting that these ideas and these design patterns isn't about limiting or sort of watering down or sort of changing the core game experience that you're trying to sell across. If you want to make a really scary sort of a horror game, then it's sort of absolutely still make that. And these design patterns aren't about changing the type of that game or what experience you want the gamers to face. It's more just about letting sort of gamers sort of more customize it so that they're able to get the challenge and the game experience that they're comfortable with. And so I think that's sort of worth noting that with these patterns, it's not about throwing away designs or changing really the core game itself. It's just about making it so that more people are able to enjoy it. So when we sort of talk about accessibility in games, it's hard to not talk about The Last of Us Part 2. When this was released, it was sort of heralded as the most accessible game of all time. Sort of won and created a lot of accessibility awards. And it sort of really, took the next step forward in what accessibility should be in games. It had over 60 options and sort of covered lots of different disabilities for like vision, hearing, and motor, and sort of really did a lot to show everyone what accessibility could look like in games and what AAA games should be doing. And so I think this sort of really incredible work that sort of Naughty Dog did for The Last of Us Part 2 to really sort of raise the bar and sort of bring accessibility forward and more into light as an important thing that people should be focusing on. But that doesn't mean that we're done with accessibility. There's still a long way to go to make all games sort of really accessible for everyone. There's still features that we're missing or sort of not quite right, and so I think it's sort of important to know that even though Naughty Dog, it was a big leap forward in terms of accessibility in games, it's they've not hit the finish line. Accessibility is not done. There's still more and sort of continuous improvements that can be made. And that's again going back to the idea of how to make games accessible and sort of focusing on accessibility by design, which is really when the core of games can be accessible, which is the key thing and sort of really sells it. That's sort of something that maybe wasn't quite done in The Last of Us Part 2, something that we can do more in games, and that's why it's sort of accessibility will be a continuous thing, because as we develop new games and new features, is looking at each of those and how we can make them accessible. And sort of now just to highlight really how accessible Last of Us Part 2 is I've got a clip here from a streamer called Sightless Combat. And this is a gamer who is completely blind, they can't see anything at all. But with the accessibility options available in The Last of Us Part 2, they're still able to play and sort of enjoy the game. And so if we just take a look at that now.
We're gonna run. When it gives us control, which he does about now.
Fuck. Goddamn water! Wondered whether you fucked were in Seattle.
Navigation assistance will lead you away from enemies in this encounter. Molotov. 3.
Oh, this was a bad idea.
Arrows. 1. Weapon.
That wasn't what I wanted.
Shotgun ammo. Loaded. 2. Reserve.
Run.
1. Shotgun ammo.
Reload as we run. Oh god.
Semi-auto pistol. Pistol ammo. 6. Loaded. 10. Reserve. Silencer equipped.
Cool.
2. Pistol ammo.
Yes! We did it!
Got you, asshole!
So I think that's always sort of really sort of fascinating for me to see, because it's so incredible that, you know, through the accessibility options that they've put in The Last of Us, someone's able to complete, you know, that boss fight without ever having seeing what's going on or sort of the layout of the level. And so I think it sort of really just blows my mind. You know, this was actually also taken from his permadeath playthrough. So it's, again, as we were talking before about not having accessibility options locked behind difficulty, because it means that a gamer who plays with accessibility options is still able to experience that challenge and the risk of playing something on the most on a really hard difficulty and still be able to enjoy and actually play it, rather than having certain things locked on and having to bring in a co-pilot. And so, you know, through these accessibility options that they put in with the audio, with the auto navigation, it sort of just really helps making games accessible to sort of as many people as possible. And so the Last of Us 2 was actually part of the reason it was so successful with accessibility in terms of all that, is because of the continuous feedback they did. You know, it comes from bringing in advisors and consultants and talking about them, about what they play in games or how they play, to sort of find out about more accessibility options, and then also actually test their accessibility options to make sure they're working as expected. And so it's important, you know, to be involving these advisors and consultants at all stages, so that you can sort of look at things early on and sort of maybe tweak designs a little if they're not going to be accessible, or adding other options. And then also, like I said, to test the accessibility features to actually make sure they're working as expected, to make sure something like the narration of when you're switching between weapons is actually working correctly and sort of addresses the problem that you're hoping to address. And it's also important to not just get feedback really from one person. You don't just talk to, you know, one gamer with a motor disability. It's sort of, because each gamer is different and can have different sort of ways they play and sort of different problems and different experiences, but also want different things from games. So it's important to really talk about and get as many different views as possible, so that we can really make it accessible for everyone, as opposed to just these sort of certain types of gamers. And so this really just highlights the importance of the idea of nothing about us without us, sort of making sure that everything we're doing in terms of accessibility and sort of, you know, communication with gamers with disabilities, that we are involving them at all stages. And it's just really important to make sure that we're not just trying to make accessibility, because it's like I don't know, you know, personal experience of how certain gamers with disabilities play, because that's not just something I've done myself. So it's, why should I be trying to make features really about it to try and address their problems. It should be sort of communicating and getting that feedback and sort of that open sort of discussion with them. I think it's sort of really important. So in terms of IOI, what we're doing for accessibility, we recently did a accessibility workshop where we were able to talk with a couple of gamers with disabilities, and really it sort of just opened our eyes a lot to gamers' experiences of how they play games and what they're playing, and the importance of accessibility options. So sort of showed and highlighted that gamers still want the challenge from the gameplay, from these difficulty options, but they want the challenge to come from the gameplay itself, not having to fight the game or the controls. So if there's something with like the joystick that's inaccessible for certain people, then they want to be able to customize that so that it's easier and more accessible for them, so that they're still able to then get into the gameplay and still have that challenge and fun that comes from it. The workshop also actually helps us improve some accessibility in Hitman 3, because we were chatting there to a gamer who was hard of hearing, and they were talking about how important mono audio was for them and how much that without it they struggled to actually play games. And so this was something that after hearing, we talked to our sound team and were able to actually put into Hitman 3, because it was something that it was a smaller amount of work, but we didn't realize how important it actually was and how great it can be for gamers. And so by talking with the gamers, we sort of realized that, how important things like this was. And so it was great to get that sort of direct feedback and sort of hear about their experiences with those kind of things. And then there's also this great quote that really came out of it. I don't want to pick games around my disability. I want to pick games because I want to play them. So it's the idea of, letting gamers be able to pick and play any game they want to play because it's accessible for them, rather than being locked into a certain genre or certain types of games because they're the only ones that are actually accessible for them. And we're also now sort of still in the early stages, but we're looking at having, sort of monthly studio meetings to discuss accessibility and about what we can be doing. We've set some online spaces for people to share information and sort of talk about other games and sort of really sort of evaluate what's going on. We've got regular accessibility meetings with the game projects where we can sort of discuss what they're doing with accessibility and sort of how we can sort of make the sort of designs more accessible and trying to be involved earlier on. We're also getting some training in accessible player experiences, so the APX that we sort of talked about before, sort of actually being trained in those design patterns so that we can do more and help more with making our games accessible, and also sort of bringing in accessibility advisors so we can talk to them and sort of learn about their experiences, so ask some great questions. In terms of our games, in Hitman 3, we had some HUD customization for turning elements on and off to try and allow people to get rid of things that are too distracting for them, and also sort of customizing some of the gameplay, so changing some options between toggle and hold. And again, like we were talking before about accessibility being something continuous, we put walk and run toggle in the last update, and since it's had a lot of great feedback and sort of some of that, it's like it's a step in the right direction, but it needs tweaking. So it's sort of something that we kind of missed a little bit in how we thought the feature would be used, and how accessible, and really it's working people that are using it a lot. And so it's something that now we'll try and address in the next update. And so that's the kind of idea, we put in an accessibility option and it's not quite working, so let's tweak it again rather than waiting to the next sort of game. We also have sort of hit subtitles controls for adding a background and sort of customizing that and sort of adding the speaker indicator. And then also sort of, like I mentioned, the audio for mono option. In terms of our future games, we'll be looking at sort of including more that accessible by design idea sort of in our upcoming titles, so that we can make sure that the core of the features is accessible, and sort of looking at then accessibility options when that's not quite true. We're investing time and resources into accessibility tech and the sort of backbone team that can then benefit all our game projects. And then hopefully looking at sort of accessibility testing again with these advisors and consultants to make sure that these features that we're putting in and the game itself is actually sort of more accessible, along with some other things that hopefully we'll be able to talk about soon. So what can you do? I suppose the first thing is sort of be aware of accessibility. It's not going away. It's a really important thing, and it sort of highlighted that through accessibility, suddenly games are available to more people, more games are more available, and so why would we want to go back to a time when gamers weren't able to play certain games? So I think it's sort of really important to just know that be aware that accessibility is here to stay. It's not a phase. It's nothing like that. It's a new commonplace in all games. Should be talking about accessibility. Sort of be a champion in your team and your projects to really sort of push for accessibility and sort of talk about what you're doing and sort of what other games are doing and whether designs or features are actually accessible. So I think it's just talking about it, making it part of the discussion is a really important thing to be doing. Consider accessibility in your workflow. So as mentioned, accessibility by design is really when features can be the most accessible. And so by thinking about accessibility earlier on in the game's life cycle really helps to make them truly accessible, as opposed to just putting in a couple of options, a couple of months before the game's release, because there's some things that aren't accessible, so just trying to shoehorn things in doesn't really make for a great accessible experience. You can also recommend watching streams of sort of gamers with disabilities to sort of just see how they play, what they're playing. I think can be really great sort of information, sort of feedback about what and how they're playing, and sort of can really open your eyes into things. And then absolutely sort of reaching out to gamers, advisors, and consultants with disabilities to sort of talk about their experiences, what they're playing, and sort of how accessibility works for them, the kind of things they're doing. I think it's just really important to be having that open and continuous discussion with them. So I think that's definitely something that everyone should really be doing. So if you still want to know some more information, I'd definitely recommend looking at the Microsoft Learn Gaming Accessibility Fundamentals training that they offer. It sort of really helps to just go through the basics of accessibility and sort of teach and sort of look at some of the things we could be doing. So definitely recommend that. Check out the accessible play experience design patterns online. So I think if you just Google APX or accessible player experience, that will sort of take you to the website and sort of all those design patterns, and you can order the cards from them as well. And I think it's sort of just a really great sort of source of information. You can also look at the guidelines from the game accessibility and sort of Xbox accessibility, which really look at sort of different aspects of the games and how we can make it more accessible, and sort of what are some easy wins versus sort of more costly ways to make the game more accessible. And so I think they're just really great resources. The Able Gamers Charity Foundation also just has a lot of information again about accessibility and sort of disabilities, and so it's a really great place. And then the GA conference, which I think was the US one, was actually just the past couple of days, really has a lot of great talks from lots of games companies about what they've been doing with accessibility. And so I think if you want to know more information, I definitely recommend sort of checking out and watching those past conferences. So that was everything that I wanted to go through in this sort of webinar. So thank you all very much for listening. I guess if there's any questions, we'll try and answer those now. Thank you very much. Cool. So we've already got one question in of, do you consider content warnings as part of accessibility design? So including information about content that may be triggering for players, like certain kinds of violence. I don't know if it's maybe part of accessibility design. I think if it's something that's important for the game, then absolutely, keep it in. But then it's sort of, again, making sure it's communicated to gamers so that they know, and then looking at, maybe options to tweak how those how that content can be seen. So if it's something like sort of just being able to skip those scenes, or sort of changing how they're portrayed, I think is really it's sort of important to include. And maybe a great example of this is the in Grounded with their spiders. They have, it's a crucial part of the game design, and so they kept them in, but they just added the option for people who had, arachnophobia or sort of this fear with dealing with the spiders, where they could just have a slider to change how those spiders look. So they're still keeping that content and sort of game feature in, but they're just allowing people to customize it. And so absolutely, if you have strong content like that would be triggering, then definitely absolutely including the warnings when the game is booted up, and then also working out earlier on during the design how to make it accessible so that either can be bypassed or sort of tweaked to how it's sort of portrayed so that people can still sort of enjoy those experiences. Another question, how do you balance accessibility and ease of use with immersion and conflicting design pillars? That's a great question. I think the best thing to do there is to sort of just look at the core design pillar and feature that you want to get in, and if it's something that you keep that way, absolutely. But then looking at options for tweaking it or scaling it and having it, maybe more as a slider, and sort of think about that way. And so it's sort of something that someone can customize so that they can sort of more choose their personal balance. Because then maybe, if there's a game feature that they put in, they can, and that you want to allow someone to have, I think it's in the access patterns, there's a challenge gym or, a training gym. So letting someone be able to try out sort of experiences outside of the core game loop. So if you have something that's you want this immersion and sort of with the design idea, then having a gym that they're able to practice in, and then having accessibility options that they're able to then customize maybe the difficulty or sort of different parts of that design, so that they can sort of choose their own balance as opposed to you having to balance it yourself. And then absolutely, again, it would just be one of those of bringing in gamers with disabilities, letting them sort of try it early on to sort of get their impact, and then sort of try and balance it that way, as opposed to just us trying to balance it ourselves, because we'll never truly know. Another question, how do you prioritize a feature to improve accessibility due to disability more than another? Yeah, I think that's a great question. I suppose part of it will come down to maybe time. How much time do you have to spend on the feature to sort of make it accessible, and then it's sort of, if they're both maybe the same sort of time and same sort of cost, I suppose it's sort of looking at more which could be more benefits, or sort of talking to your community to see which would be the more beneficial, or sort of maybe looking at it's like if there's a way we can do one and then do a smaller version of the other, to still try and include both, and then have them both coming in and sort of bring them both into par in an update or sort of in the next game. I think just it can honestly be a bit tough, and sort of will very much varies game to game and feature to feature. But I think maybe if it's more, if you can't do both, then seeing if there's a way you can sort of do a reduced version of both, so you're still able to put them both in, and then afterwards, or sort of in the next game, seeing how you can sort of improve and sort of build upon them both, sort of try and make it as accessible to everyone. But again, I suppose part of it would just definitely come down to talking to the community for your game to sort of see what's sort of the most valuable for them. Another question, where do you see some of the biggest challenges and opportunities in boarding the player in game in menu to best use the accessibility features? So I guess the best opportunity to sort of really onboard them is making sure it's the first thing that people see. So when they boot up the game, before any cutscenes are triggered, before they get into any menus, there is the accessibility screen. So they're able to, straight off the bat, see what's able to be done, and sort of be able to then go through each of those options, which can then be a challenge of, might be concerning of overwhelming people with options, with accessibility options. But what we've found from chatting to gamers is that they'd rather have way too many options and be sort of maybe bombarded with them, as opposed to not having enough. So I wouldn't be concerned about that aspect, and I think it's sort of, in terms of the biggest opportunity, is definitely allowing people to have instant feedback of sort of what they're actually customizing. So when it's changing subtitle size, making sure there's something on screen so that they're able to see what their new size is going to be. They don't have to customize it, wait for the next cutscene, see that it's still too small, pause, customize it again, and sort of that back and forth. So having that sort of instant sort of recognition and sort of instant feedback of the things they're changing, I think is the biggest opportunity really in onboarding the accessibility features, and really will make the most use out of it, is just letting them sort of see immediately what they're doing and what they're changing. Check if there's any other questions. Another question. Could you elaborate a little on the preparation process for designing a video game with accessibility in mind from the get-go? Sure. So I suppose from the beginning of the game, and it's looking about how to make it accessible. I suppose the two things of looking at similar games to see what they've done. Not in terms of just like with accessibility options, but checking out reviews. So there's an accessibility review website called Can I Play That, which I definitely recommend looking at it for your own games. It's we received some great feedback from the Hitman games from there, and sort of looking at that to see what similar genre games have done, and sort of that will tell you what similar issues people have had, and then also, again, I keep saying it, but bringing people in from the community, sort of talk to them about it. So I know we like to keep games secret and not really talk about what we're actually doing, but trying to listen and sort of talk about maybe if you can't go into specifics, but the rough genre, third person action game, how do you usually find those, what accessibility things are you after, the things that have been done well and done right, and sort of looking about it and talking about it there. And then it's very much planning planning how to make the game accessible is then split into maybe like two sections of, you've got the gameplay and the game design and game ideas. So like if there's going to be puzzles, addressing each of those and working out how each of them can be made accessible. If there's going to be shooting, looking at sort of auto lock on and sort of adding options to tweak that. So you have that kind of planning and sort of thinking and designing how to make those bits accessible, but then you also have the bigger sort of aspect of the game. And so this is things like having controller remap. So it's not something that's just a specific gameplay feature, it's just the general game needs to be able to remap controls. Adding narration to all the UI and elements and menus. Sort of a high contrast mode, which they sort of showed off with The Last of Us and God of War, and sort of planning and looking at ways to make the general spoke of the game accessible, which can then be applied to future projects, sort of with your engine, or sort of then looking at the individual game elements. And really each of those is more, looking at the design patterns and looking at each game idea and applying those patterns and lenses, and sort of think about, right, how do we, from the beginning, when the design is sort of been approved and sort of, it's the fun has been found, looking at them and then sort of applying those accessibility and sort of design patterns and lenses to work out how to actually make them accessible. And sorry, so final question. what are the most impactful changes a game developer can do to retroactively add accessibility features in a game that's already launched. So this, to be honest, will 100% just vary game from game. And I think the most impactful thing you can do is check out accessibility reviews for your game. So look at Can I Play That? Look at any others, sort of talk to the community of, or reach out to gamers with disabilities to find out if they were able to play your game, and if not, why weren't they able to play the game? I think it's sort of if you want to add accessibility features to game after you launch, I think it's great. And I think the biggest wins or the most impactful things you can do is just look at where the complaints are. And so it's, again, looking at the accessible player experiences in those two things, the access patterns and the challenge patterns. So reading through those reviews and chatting to gamers, is the biggest problem that people can't access the game, or is the biggest problem that people can't actually do the gameplay? They're struggling with the gameplay elements. And so I think then when you look at it through those 2 points and sort of work out, okay, it's the biggest problem we're having is people are unable to access the game. Why can't they access the game? They're finding the controls are too awkward, there's no menu narration, the UI elements are too small, so they can't read it. Then you know that the access is the biggest thing you can be looking at and tweaking to improve. But then if it's more, they're struggling with the gameplay, if there's there's too many jumping puzzles and I just can't do it, there's too much information going on at once and I can't find anything that's going on, it's sort of overwhelming, then you look at sort of customizing those sort of elements. So there's no just do this option, or just add menu narration. I think is a very impactful thing. But if the rest of the gameplay isn't accessible for someone who is blind, then the menu narration is only a small step in the right direction. And so, yeah, I'd just say look at the reviews, talk to people, and it's sort of looking and working out whether it's an access issue or a challenge issue. And that's all the time and questions we have. So thank you all very much for tuning in today. I hope you learned a lot and sort of found it really useful. And it's sort of just great to sort of present this information. So thank you very much, and make sure to sort of follow the IO Interactive channels for any upcoming events on sort of Twitter and LinkedIn. And that's it. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you very much. Bye.